Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Guys, you have specifically focused in a certain area about the assassination when it came to rogue elements of the CIA. We're going to cut right into the meat and potatoes. But first, before we get there, the giant theory of the assassination, which obviously there's many theories that kind of prevail throughout. I want you guys to briefly introduce yourselves. David, you can start, and then Youssef, you can go next.
My name is David Denton. I'm a history professor at Atlee Central College. I also run the JFK Historical Group, which has been for a long time been involved with of having conferences associated with the assassination, bringing researchers and authors together to talk about this subject. In fact, the political assassinations of the 1960s. I've written several articles on the subject as well, and I've spent a lot of time working with the recently declassified documents and going through some of that. And that's kind of my background. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Youssef El-Gingihy. So I'm over in the UK, where we only have probably a handful of researchers compared to you guys. So I've had an amateur interest in the subject of the JFK assassination going back to my teenage years, several decades ago, I think, particularly going back to kind of growing up with Oliver Stone's work. And lately I've been working on kind of, a couple of things, really, a PhD on CIA covert operations, particularly the Cuban operations during the Kennedy presidency, and currently working on a book project on the same subject, but particularly focusing on the life and times of David Atley Phillips.
We'll keep this conversation going the same way we just kind of introduced ourselves here, but I wanted to talk about one of the giant theories, which a lot of the public seems to believe. I do, as well as I'm sure you guys do, which is talking about rogue elements of the CIA being behind the JFK assassination. Now, in the beginning, when the assassination happened, I don't know how long it took, whether it was from the Church Committee or the Rockefeller Commissions, until we started seeing that there were CIA possible involvement in the JFK assassination. But it has become one of the more dominant theories out there when we talk about the JFK assassination and not believing the lone gunman official narrative version. I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on why you think that there is this kind of aspect of looking at the CIA when it comes to involvement of JFK, whether that's maybe prehistory when it comes with the Cold War stuff and stuff that JFK was doing at the time, or maybe stuff that you found out later when it came to the Church Committee or any of the other panels or just documents that you were able to sift across.
Well, I think you mentioned the Church Committee, and certainly America in general did not have an awareness of the dark activities of the CIA up until the 1970s. They were completely, working in darkness. I mean, they had no oversight on the part of the Congress. They had unlimited budgets. Obviously, at the time of the Warren Commission had no knowledge of the assassination plots, executive action, or anything like that the CIA had conducted against obviously other folks that you saw in obviously Guatemala, Lumumba in Africa, those things that went on. Even the Warren Commission was not aware of it. And I think Allen Dulles made sure of that. And so it wasn't the Church Committee the reveal starts to happen, the fact that there were other assassination plots, which certainly doesn't indict the CIA in terms of assassination of JFK, but certainly shows that a willingness to engage in that type of extreme and radical activity. I've always believed if you want to know the truth about what happened in Dallas, you've got to find people that I would describe as radical, whether they were inside or outside the United States government. They had to be willing to commit to radical action in terms of the willingness to overthrow a government, to assassinate a leader. And I think there were certainly folks inside the CIA that were capable of, we know, in the Executive Action Program, which ultimately William Harvey, which I can talk a lot about, who oversaw that program. But I think it's probably a mistake to suggest that a single entity like, let's just say rogue CIA agents engaged and pulled off all this thing by themselves. I think it's bigger than that. I think there's more involvement on a wider level than that, but you can certainly see the connections with certain individuals in the CIA. The CIA was very compartmentalized. I've looked at the personnel files of Harvey, of Morales, of Phillips, and there's just there's a lot there to suggest what these guys were capable of.
It wouldn't be out of character, is what you're saying.
Yeah, not out of character at all. And let's just point out the fact that one of those new things is that's come on is that it wasn't just the CIA was also connected to an operation out of the United States military that we've been looking a lot lately called AXI, which is an abbreviation for a counterintelligence unit in the United States military. And that a number of these folks, like Dorothy Matlack, like two or three other individuals inside this military counterintelligence unit, were also connected to the CIA. And AXI was also an organization that even put on paper that they were committed to political assassinations of Castro. So you had these people you first have to look for folks who have a background and a willingness to commit to radical action. And I think there were those people inside the CIA, whether they operated in a rogue fashion or under the orders of others besides them. You can certainly see some things there. That would be my opening statement about that.
Yeah. So I think, huge amount that David has thrown up there that I would, wholeheartedly endorse. I think that it I think became apparent even in the 1960s with the Garrison case that, had huge kind of national and international profile. Garrison became a public figure, and he was obviously subjected to a huge smear campaign. And I think that in itself, even then in the mid to late 60s, began to create huge doubts, along with a whole smattering of other kind of very important researchers such as Mark Lane and so on, began to open up these cracks in the official story in the Warren Commission report, and it began to kind of collapse there as a kind of house of cards. But yeah, I mean, I think obviously in the 70s, what we saw with the House investigation, first, of course, the other investigations, but what we saw there was the kind of newer versions of the story, which is the kind of what's known as, in I think Intel terms, as a limited hangout. And that limited hangout evolves into, oh, well, it was the mafia. And of course, no doubt there would have been involvement from elements of the mafia who were involved in, of course, in Mongoose. And you then hear different versions about Cuban exiles. And I think, one of the latest, current versions, of course, with the amount of exposure that we've seen with the latest files, of course, is that I think in recent years we're even hearing this from, at least one person in the CIA themselves, is this idea that it was a group of rogue officers, kind of renegade elements. And that itself, as I think, again, I'd have to agree with David, we're getting further towards the truth. But when you look at the kind of really the kind of even the kind of hearsay confessions, but from the likes of Morales, from Howard Hunt, I think the very interesting thing about Howard Hunt's, so-called deathbed confession, where he fingers a whole, clique of these covert operators in the Directorate of Plans who could have been involved, could have been behind the Kennedy assassination. And that actually, bizarrely, has been ignored by a lot of people in the research community. But one of the very interesting things that Hunt says is that there was authorization from above, is what he'd been told, supposedly, by David Sanchez Morales. And I think that's very important. I think the idea that if you look at the life and the careers of these people, David Atley Phillips, possibly David Sanchez Morales, Bill Harvey, the idea, these were people who followed orders. They took orders and they executed very effectively these operations, these covert ops across, many countries. I think the idea that they would have suddenly, as a small kind of group of them, that they would have just kind of gone rogue and carried out the biggest operation of them all, which would have been assassinating, the president of the United States without any kind of, authorization or instructions from kind of the senior hierarchy. I think it's very, very difficult to imagine that scenario. It's possible, of course, that you can make the arguments that what was going on in Mongoose, what was going on in JM Wave was something that somehow spiraled out of control. But I think you struggle really in terms of trying to make that actually a very plausible narrative.
Before we get into specific details, or maybe this question will lead us into specific details about individuals, I just wanted to bring up kind of like an argument point, which is people would say, yeah, it could happen in another country, but it wouldn't happen here. And I kind of bring up a point or example, which would be J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, he was in charge of the Bureau and modeled the FBI after himself, but he was wiretapping congressmen and doing a bunch of illegal activities that we would consider unethical in terms of his own guidance or what he thought was right. So when you're looking at assets of the CIA, doing assassination plots overseas, it wouldn't be too out of character for them to want to strategize or do something, whether it was on orders or whether it was on their own accord. It just depends on what the background of these individuals are, which I'm hoping we can go into. We can start off with William Harvey if you'd like, or we can start off with David Atley Phillips or any of the lists. I'm sure you're not going to be able to name every body that was involved, but obviously we have characters and we have backgrounds of ones that have a particular interest and might have possible involvement. Whether that came later, I'm sure with a lot of the documentation. I was actually surprised at the HSCA's focus when it came to, I know we talk about organized crime was their model thing, but they looked at a lot of documentation of some of these individuals, or at least some backgrounds of some CIA activities that I was pretty surprised about. And I was like, no wonder Blakey couldn't get anything from you guys. I didn't expect half the stuff he was requesting for to be like JM Wave related material.
Well, let's talk about Harvey first, because I think Harvey is, I don't know. I think Harvey and Morales are kind of and to some sense, we can talk about Hunt too, Phillips, being whatever the three musketeers, four musketeers.
They don't look like secret operatives, I'll tell you that much, but I guess that's the point.
Okay, I've looked and seen a lot of documents. We did a FOIA on Harvey and Morales and got about 400 documents back from the CIA here a couple years ago. Plus, the stuff has just been released, and you can glean a lot about. There's not anything there that says Bill Harvey killed the president, and yet his. I always say Harvey has the perfect profile for someone who would have been willing to engage in this assassination plot, and even the euphemistic way in which the CIA in his personnel file describes Harvey still leaves this pathway to show that he could have done. I mean, his file says he was involved in some highly sensitive operations that we can't even talk about here in this classified document. It said he was willing to go beyond his superior officers, meaning he was willing to do something rogue. He had a cadre of loyal Harvey men. I would assume many of them Cuban exiles, willing to do whatever he said. And then you look at it, look at his background and what he was involved with. Well, he ran the executive action program. Their job was assassination. He in the summer of when we were at the height of the Bay of Pigs crisis, Harvey, talking about willingness to go rogue, I think that's what the CIA mentions that, because he sent his team of operators in Cuba to start operations even prior to an invasion in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't wait. He assumed we were going to have World War III. And in the process, he pretty much pissed off everybody in the CIA, even some of the top people, about the fact that he just sent those folks in. He got on the wrong side with the Kennedy administration. He obviously had an extreme hatred of the Kennedys. His wife, there's a videotape you can see of his wife after his death saying he thought the Kennedys were scum. He's stationed in Rome, which put him in a perfect position prior to the assassination, almost an exile, but an ability to probably recruit foreign assassins. There's some suggestion that that Harvey was back in the United States in September of '63. He lies about who QJ Wynn was, a potential assassin. When pressed by the House Select Committee about what it would take to assassinate someone, when they were asked about his affairs with Lumumba, he just blurted out and said, "Hey, it just takes one person to carry out an whole operation, to kill the person, bury the body, and tell no one." I mean, he made a statement in front of the House Select Committee in that regards. And then finally, I want to bring up Harvey's relationship with Johnny Roselli, this liaison between the mob. There's a document that the CIA released about their relationship with Roselli. We know they admit they were dealing with mob figures like Roselli, and they have a chronology of it. But when it came time for Harvey to take over operationally John Roselli in 1962, the document in that regard suggests we don't know what Harvey was doing operationally. We don't know what happened after that. Really, that tells me the CIA either really didn't know what Harvey and Roselli were up to in 1962 and beyond, or they're not just telling us, or they're not putting it on paper. So I just kind of gave you a series of circumstantial things that really, point the finger at who, Harvey being a guy capable of and very suspicious in this whole thing. I mean, that's how I see him. And in some respects, Morales the same too. But I want to give Youssef a chance to talk about Harvey too before I go into Morales.
Yes, yeah. I mean, fantastic. Sorry, I've lost the screen. Bear with me. I mean, great stuff there from David. Of course, I think the really interesting stuff on Harvey beyond the kind of obviously the primary sources in terms of the declassified files and so on is his biographer Bayard Stockton, who was he wasn't some kind of bleeding heart liberal. He was a CIA man, I believe himself, and he was good friends with Harvey. And I mean, his biography is pretty damning, really, about Harvey's putative role in something like the JFK assassination. I don't think you can read that biography, which I think is pretty much one of the main kind of book sources on his life, without coming to the conclusion that he was very likely kind of heavily involved in it. But yeah, I mean, I think there's both sides here, which David has, I think, fleshed out very nicely, which is that the kind of persona, the personality that emerged in the 70s from Bill Harvey and kind of the Washington Post and so on, was this kind of, shooting from the hip, hard drinking, kind of psychopathic, alcoholic character. And it's quite conceivable that someone like him running ZR Rifle, yes, running the Executive Action Assassinations Program, some of the things he did and said, as you've mentioned, during the missile crisis, running, teams into the, I think whichever area I forget the name of now, these were the things which led to the kind of explosive fallout with Bobby Kennedy, the kind of comments attributed to him by various sources that Bobby Kennedy would say stuff like, "Oh, I'm going to, take some people down for some, training at my place." And Bobby Kennedy meaning in like covert ops, and Bill Harvey would say, "You mean babysitting or something?" So I think he was a very, difficult and dangerous, kind of mad, bad, and dangerous to know character. But at the same time, his wife, CJ Harvey herself, with a kind of intelligence background, and I think that the first female in US history to attain the rank of, was it colonel or something? I can't remember the exact details, but she felt very aggrieved at this kind of representation of Harvey, and she said, he was a very, I mean, of course, she's got a certain degree of bias, but he was a very effective officer who would never who would always follow commands and instructions and so on. And I think it's very interesting when we look at that group of characters that I think we're going to touch on, that if you buy into the idea that the kind of CIA senior hierarchy, and again, this is something that's been questioned by others, but if you buy into the idea that people like Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, James Jesus Angleton, Tracy Barnes, and others, that these were kind of blue bloods, that they were WASP, Ivy League types from kind of quite elite backgrounds, that these were the people running the agency. I've spoken to people in interviews who've questioned that idea, that even that is a construct. But if you buy into that idea, you look at that kind of group who are being kind of smeared as rogue officers, David Atley Phillips, Bill Harvey, David Sanchez Morales, even Howard Hunt. And I think what unifies them is that they're actually outsiders. Phillips is a Texan who kind of flunked out of uni. CJ Harvey said about her husband, Bill Harvey, that he was always looked down upon by the CIA people because he studied law at Indiana University. Howard Hunt, I think, liked to pretend that he had a kind of more elite background, but he didn't really. It was all kind of quite confected, it seems. And finally, David Sanchez Morales, of course, was very much an outsider with his kind of mixed kind of, I think, Cuban, Indian, well, Mexican Indian kind of background. So I think these people were never really, although they were essential to these kind of, to running these operations on the ground. And of course, Phillips rose to become number 3 in the agency. But I remember talking to, sorry, I've had a bit of a mental block, but kind of an author who's now in his 90s. He wrote some important works about Phillips's role down in the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, and he wrote about the kind of Pinochet coup and all of that. And he was sued by Phillips for suggesting that Phillips could have been involved in the JFK assassination. And he on several occasions met Phillips, and he remembered going to lunch, dining with this was before obviously the lawsuit, but with Phillips and others. And he remembers that the others, and I think specifically,
you might have to explain David Atley Phillips. You haven't really.
Yeah, but basically that they look down on Phillips is the point I'm driving at. Sorry, I've got on a bit of a digression, but they treated him with a certain amount of disdain. Some of the kind of blue bloods in the senior hierarchy. So even though he did, of course, rise up to the top of the agency, and I think that's very interesting about that kind of clique of those, for example, 4 officers that they were to some extent outsiders, really.
Do you mind explaining David Atley Phillips? You didn't explain him. You kind of just mentioned people's thoughts on him. So I'm curious, who is David Atley Phillips? What's his? Obviously, you would put him on the list too, but
yes, yeah. So David Atley Phillips, very interesting character. He was at the time of the assassination, he was a mid-level officer. He wasn't someone very senior. Someone like David Sanchez Morales was certainly more senior than Phillips at that point in time in terms of the kind of mongoose and JM Wave hierarchy. Phillips was kind of a Texan. He grew up in Fort Worth. He was had a very colorful kind of life. He was a POW during World War II. He was caught by the Nazis, put in a prison camp, managed to escape a couple of times, eventually was reunited with the kind of GIs. And he'd been a kind of rear gunner in the Air Force. And then he decided he kind of had a bit of a fling with theatre, basically with acting. He wrote a play based on his kind of POW experiences, and he even got a kind of stipend for it. And it was unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, it was kind of not spiked, but he was kind of beaten to it by the play that later became, I think it was Stalag 17, is that right? Which became a big, kind of fairly big Broadway hit. And he, Phillips would often muse how different his life might have been. But in fact, these kind of extracurricular skills, the kind of acting, the theatre, the drama side, which that kind of amateur dramatics, he kept that up, throughout his life. Wherever he went, wherever he was posted, he was always involved in some kind of amateur dramatic group. Those kind of skills, I think, were deployed very effectively in his life as a spy. He hated that word, by the way, spy, but as a covert operator. So it's actually quite an important aspect of his life. But then he was recruited. He moved to Chile. This would have been the late 40s, even early 50s. And he bizarrely bought a kind of an English language newspaper, which had, for English language papers in that area in the cone of Latin America, it had the biggest circulation as English language paper, out of the English language papers. And that was the point at which it's not clear, it's a kind of chicken and the egg situation. That's the point at which he seems to have got recruited by the agency, and he was involved in kind of local operations recruitment of kind of leftists. And one of the people, fascinatingly, that at that point he reveals that he was already monitoring was Salvador Allende. This was, of course, some many years before Allende became president of Chile. But yeah, he was involved at that point. He quickly became involved in the Guatemala operation, and his work during that, in terms of propaganda, in terms of psychological operations, was so effective and sterling that he was basically highly commended. And he kind of, that really kind of brought him into the fold amongst, quite a, relatively small clique of people, Dulles, who obviously was director at that point, along with the likes of Tracy Barnes, who'd kind of personally recruited him into the Guatemala coup. And so he became very close to that.
To names that people specifically point out in the assassination.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the point, is that when I've spoken to, even people in the, former CIA officers, they've, who have an interest in the subject and who've spoken up about it. One of the things, they mention is that you would need a group of about 15 to 20 officers who basically trust each other with their life. And I think when you look at these people, they had worked on, as David mentioned, on other operations, on other assassinations, on regime change together. They knew each other kind of from an operational point of view intimately, and they became kind of, personally and professionally very close. So we see that with Guatemala. We see that later on. Phillips is involved in the Middle East briefly, a brief kind of foray into that, where he escapes narrowly with his life. Before he's involved in kind of Cuban operations, during the Revolutionary War, and afterwards with, of course, the kind of assassination plots against Castro, and Bay of Pigs, again, the same clique are involved, and Mongoose. So these are people who operators over the course of a good 10 or more years had very kind of close professional and personal relationships.
Well, from my standpoint on Phillips, I think you have to, of course, at the center of the whole assassination research community for a long time has been this storyline about Antonio Viciana, the Cuban exile, who was, right in the middle of Alpha 66, one of the most suspicious and extreme radical groups of the Cuban exiles. And the whole storyline, of course, was that David Atley Phillips, a.k.a. Maurice Bishop, met with both Oswald and Viciana prior to the assassination. That came out, Kate and Ponce. Then Viciana kind of recanted that story. And then about 10 years ago, late in his life, Viciana comes back and says, yeah, I was the Maurice Bishop, the agent I met with Oswald in September of 63. I was actually David Atley Phillips. Now, there's a lot of folks that if that's true, that's pretty damning about Phillips. Yet, I mean, I know John Newman is a great researcher who's got in a lot of stuff, has doubts about Viciana's story. But then you talk to a guy like Dick Russell, another great researcher, who said, no, I met Viciana. I think he's telling the truth. So we got some debatable point there. I mean, Viciana's timeline about Phillips maybe doesn't match up. It would certainly put Phillips in the middle of setting up Oswald if, in fact, there was a meeting prior to the assassination. I don't know. I mean, Phillips is like you said, Phillips was a propaganda guy. He immediately after the assassination, he's got all his assets out there in Mexico City, claiming that Oswald was connected to the Cubans and the Russians. So we know after the fact he's doing things. Beyond that, there's a case to be made about David Atley Phillips, I think. I mean, he's connected to folks in Texas who, there's your connection to, the folks down in Texas that could be, involved in this thing on the ground. He is a Texan. He's connected to, oh geez, what is his name? One of the real Texas insiders, Gordon McClendon.
Yeah, that's who I was mentioning off air before you joined.
Who is a ultimate Texas insider. Later, who's connected to all the power players in Texas.
Well, he ran a radio corporation. I can't remember if it's KLIF or KBox.
And then in the 1970s, it's McClendon and Phillips who go around defending the agency, trying to create a counter narrative when the House Select Committee was investigating the assassination. We know that Phillips probably lied his ass off to Congress about videos prior to the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. We know that there were those like Tannenbaum who wanted to prosecute Phillips for lying to Congress. So there's a lot there. Now, when you look at Morales, his personnel file, one of the things is, to me, I look at the files and Morales is kind of considered to be a rock star, man. His personnel file describes Morales as a one-man gang, that he was willing and capable of doing anything. And again, the term even that listed all the things that Morales was capable of. And then it even says, and other activities that we're really not willing to go into. So again, and sometimes in the personnel files, in the declassified files about these guys, it's not always what's said, but it's the way it's said, maybe in a euphemistic manner, or what they leave out. These three guys, like Youssef said, are somehow engaged in this whole story. To what degree, to what level? That remains to be seen. Was Alan Dulles the puppet master at the top of all this? That's a great question. He met with LBJ in September of '63. He's put in charge of almost the entire investigation, talking about the fox running the hen house. Here's Dulles running the whole investigation of the Warren Commission. There's a document, and I know I'm running. I want to give you a chance to respond to this, but I did find a document in regards to Alan Dulles that I thought was very intriguing. It was spring of '64, where there's one of the first books that came out on conspiracy, written by an Englishman. His name escaped me. It was one of the very first books written. And right away, Richard Helms sends a classified document to then private citizen Alan Dulles, who had been fired, saying, hey, there's a guy in England writing a book about conspiracy. You probably need to look into this. So what that tells me right away is the CIA at the very top understood that Dulles was the guy we need to tell about to squelch and crush any conspiracy notions. He was the guy in charge of the cover-up. So to me, those are things that are very important. Okay, I just want to get that in. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Maybe we can give a brief breakdown of Morales here, since we've talked about the other two.
Yeah, Morales. David Sanchez Morales. He was basically. I think he joined the army actually after the war. Off the top of my head, I believe he was perhaps too young to kind of to be in the war itself, off the top of my head. But he was kind of a footballer. He was a very athletic, physical guy, very intimidating, and but he was bright, and he quickly kind of got into army and military intelligence, and I think from there into the agency, and I think through his extraordinary kind of physical and mental attributes, I think he rose up quite quickly. He was obviously, as we've mentioned, in the Guatemala operation. He then became involved in Cuban ops, in of course the Bay of Pigs and Mongoose, and I think Morales is, there. I guess beyond the documents, I'm not sure, how much we know about him. He's more of a kind of a legendary figure. I think the most incriminating thing, of course, is the material from the likes of Fonzie, really, Gaetan Fonzie, who was an investigative journalist enlisted into the House investigation, and he ended up obviously tracking down a whole bunch of people, including Morales's, childhood best friend, and another kind of friend who was an attorney, Robert Walton, and it was kind of Walton who eventually revealed that Morales had confessed to both of them about his involvement in the assassination, and with some very kind of incriminating statements. And this was a characteristic of Morales's personality, that when he was basically another alcoholic. These were all very hard drinking types. The whole kind of senior hierarchy, as well as the kind of JM Wave station people, were in the words of kind of one of the lower ranks, Bradley Ayres, who came to believe in later years and wrote books about it, that this clique had intimate operational knowledge of the Kennedy assassination. He describes that they would just sit around, getting absolutely, smashed, basically. And Morales, when drunk, became, a very, as with Harvey, I suspect, a rather out of control kind of character. And Morales would actually become quite indiscreet. And he would, he'd start talking about secret classified stuff. That's been mentioned by several people. And I think in the end, towards as this Pandora's box opened during the 70s, this became very irritating to the agency. He has this picture kind of taken, and it's published in a kind of a local paper, with kind of a subtext about his involvement in kind of counterintelligence operations and so on. So I think Morales was not, very careful, and Fonzi kind of, doesn't directly say it, but in his account, which for those who haven't read it out there, The Last Investigation, a great starting point for trying to delve into the subject. But he seems to indicate that his best friend, who couldn't bring himself to mention that confession about the assassination, that his best friend kind of felt that Morales died in quite suspicious circumstances, where he'd, despite having retired from the agency, he would, you never really leave, as they say. He was still having to kind of go back and forth to do things. He'd bought himself a place kind of about 30 miles, I think, from the Mexican border, and he was speaking to a neighbor or a friend, and he put in a kind of state-of-the-art alarm system. And his friend said, well, what are you so worried about? You're 30 miles from the border. He said, well, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about my own people. And he talked about how, he basically considered his kind of ex-employees to be, some of the, I think in his own words, some of the most ruthless motherfuckers, excuse my language, out there, and that they wouldn't hesitate to do in their own. So he was scared. He was, and Harvey, I think, exhibited similar behavior. According to those close to him, he started I think he retired back to Indiana, and he was stashing kind of guns and stuff. So they both became, with everything that was coming out during that period of the Church Committee and then the House investigations, I think there was a real concern that the whole thing could collapse. And I think, of course, David mentions, how Helms and Dulles reacted to even early kind of exposures and disclosures. I mean, it's so that's Morales, I think, in a nutshell. But I think Harvey, likewise. I mean, David did mention some very interesting things about his what the CIA was prepared to say about what he was up to. And I think, when you look at his biography from Bayard Stockton, a fellow friend and member of the agency, Stockton describes how there's very little known about some aspects, some whole kind of swathes of Harvey's career, where he goes off to, he's running ZR Rifle, he's got QJ Win, which is, one of his kind of recruited assassins for these executive action things, and he's out in Europe. He goes off on these kind of missions, and no one really at HQ seems to know what he's up to. And he's I think goes off to Europe, and he's kind of recruiting kind of underworld assassins, possibly people like that. And he, of course, the Kennedys fire him. Bobby Kennedy falls out with him, as we've mentioned. They fire him. Where does Harvey end up? Well, Helms moves him to Italy, he becomes the station chief in Rome. And of course, for the Kennedys, they probably think, oh, well, that's way out of the way. But of course, Italy's right at the heart of Gladio. And the same thing happens with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've forgotten his name now, but the guy who'd been who was Lyman Kirkpatrick, who was I think it's no, not Lyman Kirkpatrick. Sorry, he's in the agency. It was one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who was then moved to become NATO kind of supreme commander of NATO. So for the Kennedys, I think they were oblivious to things like Gladio. I think it's quite likely that as with other politicians and even presidents and prime ministers, that they were not aware of something like Gladio. They would not have been, I think, informed of it. And the fact that Harvey finds himself in that period after he'd been nominally fired from Cuban operations, relieved of his duties, still actually being involved, as David's mentioned, with Rosselli and with some of this stuff. But he was out in Italy, and I think he would have had real access to some of these kind of underworld assets. And I think I think if we're looking at just to finish off before I hand back to David and to Robbie, I think number one in the kind of in any case that would be prosecuted against some of these individuals, I think in the case of Harvey, the kind of exhibit number one is Harvey's own handwritten notes on assassinations, where he talks about a whole list of things, and all of these things were, I won't be able to go into them right now in detail, but they're all, the key thing is they're all features of the JFK assassination. And I think that is, for me, the single most damning, probably, piece of evidence in relation to Bill Harvey.
How much weight do you guys put in information that comes out from higher ups when they start speaking about certain aspects of intelligence agencies? And obviously not being like, oh, the CIA did it, but leaving little hints or droplets of information, whether it's to the press or other things. The reason why I say that is a lot of people, if you're talking about who did it in the assassination, and if we're saying rogue elements of the CIA, they want to see a document that states that it was investigated, that this person could be behind the assassination. Where do we prominently see that? With the mafia. We see a lot of examples of that, of they had the motive and the means. I think the HSCA included on a bunch of names. But if we look at an examination of like statements like Truman talking about the CIA has long kind of coasted away from its original purpose, you have these people in high political power and connections that are making statements about certain agencies and how they might have gone rogue, which brings weight to that argument. But I'm curious on your thoughts about statements that came later as good prime evidence that you can look at these rogue elements or aspects of the CIA that could have been involved behind the assassination.
Well, before I jump in, I just want to mention two quick things before we leave Morales and Harvey, and I think Youssef kind of said that, is that when they were, at the end of their lives, they both had a drinking problem. There's some parallels here. And again, I rely a lot on what I've come up with declassified documents, but it's interesting with Morales that his file there's a note in there that says pages, I don't know, like 30 pages of his file. It's right in the document. It says were sanitized in the 1970s. So as early as the 1970s, the CIA went and just got rid of half of Morales's files. That, to me, you mentioned the suspicions about Harvey, that one about Morales. And then in regards to Harvey, he goes, when he's ready to leave the agency, I think there's a lot of sweating going on. I mean, he owed them money. They were worried about how he left. They personally asked for a kind of an exit meeting with William Harvey, who's kind of going downhill, with Richard Helms. I mean, they have a meeting. How often does the head of an agency have an exit meeting with an agent? And then after that meeting, Helms sends a nice letter to Harvey thanking him for his loyalty. So I think I think they were assured that Harvey was going to keep his mouth shut. As Youssef said, I don't think the same thing about Morales, and that's probably why Morales ended up dead. Morales did too much talk. As far as your question about uh, folks like Harry Truman alluding to things, I think you've seen politicians do that a lot. Unfortunately, they're vague about it because even in 2024, let's just say somebody came out. Let's say Trump has alluded to the fact that he might release all.
Let's avoid that, please. I'm tired of
Yeah,
reading
and because I
comments
think
about
that's
Trump.
bullshit. I think everything that comes out of Trump's mouth is
Well,
bullshit.
use a better example, which would be William Colby. I mean, what did he do? Probably the most pressure on the CIA.
Like Colby. Yeah, Colby is he'll. I think they're kind of vague, but they kind of. Colby died in
Yeah, he was vague about it, and he died. That's why people don't mention things.
I mean, Angleton threw something out there in front of Congress. What did he say? I'm not privy to everything that happened to Jack. He made that quote. I don't know if that's the phrase, but probably Truman's the guy who came the closest to basically all but saying in December of '63, man, the CIA, if I had known they would be involved in such activities, I never would have signed the National Security Act in the same place. Allen Dulles comes to Truman and says, you got to recant that statement.
Yeah.
Truman says, the hell if I am. And so Angleton starts spreading around rumors that, Truman's lost it, that he's got dementia and things like that. I think the problem is politicians or folks over the years, if they do want to touch on the subject, they risk political suicide by allying with anything associated with conspiracy. It makes it very difficult. It is and always has been the same way. But you're right. Some folks have kind of alluded to that a little bit in vague terms. Youssef, you want to follow up with that? That's kind of would be my answer to your question.
Yeah. Just remind me the question again, Robbie. Was
let's talk about people that came out later, politicians and things that made statements about the CIA, because obviously you can't find documentation that's going to say the CIA or this individual was behind it. That will never probably is already destroyed or was never written down. But you can listen to statements from certain political people or certain people that were involved in eras like that. Like even with Helms, I think it's published in Helms' biography and what was uncovered by your a friend of ours, Moran, which he said that his ghostwriter had changed his statement about, I think in the rough draft, it said that Helms was a part of thousands of covert operations. And then in his official final draft of his biography, the thousands was changed to dozens. Which is, you wouldn't think that wouldn't be a big change, but that's a significant impact. You're talking about thousands of covert operations, and people think you're doing dozens. What, a baker's dozen? Like, there's a big gap in those numbers, but obviously blending of details and certain things, and then things we were able to find out through individual memoirs of CIA people, you start to put a bigger picture of like what these agencies' role and responsibilities are. So I'm curious if you look at the after information, stuff you've mentioned already about biographies.
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems, of course, with the labyrinth that is the assassination. I mean, I think a very simple thought experiment is if Oswald did this, it would be an open and shut case. There wouldn't be 4.5 million pages of documents. There wouldn't have been countless investigations. There wouldn't be this amount of smoke, without fire. So I think the question then becomes, well, I think once you start from we're starting from kind of this a priori assumption that there was a conspiracy. I think, of course, you have to become a specialist. It is such a complex, multidisciplinary subject. And, you could spend your entire life dedicated to trying to understand the Kennedy assassination. Those kind of 6-7 seconds in Dallas, they're like a kind of what you would kind of call a vanishing point. They actually project an infinite number of shards, as has been described in kind of fiction, to connect you with all these other significant and seminal covert ops. And so I think that's very important to remember, that's probably the biggest indicator that there was a conspiracy, is the sheer amount of information connected to it. In terms of, could this have been carried out by one of these groups, for example, organized crime? I mean, I think the idea that organized crime, however influential or powerful someone like Carlos Marcello would have been in terms of his fiefdom down in Louisiana, the idea that these people would have been able to execute the the executive, the president, and that the entire power structure of the most powerful country in the world, the national security state, that none of this would move in order to prosecute them because they were perhaps blackmailed about the kind of mongoose operations. Yeah, I think that's nonsense, isn't it? So I think it's one of the cleverest things, of course, that happens with these covert operations is cutouts. You never do things yourself from the perspective of the agency. There's always a cutout, whether it's Cuban exiles, whether it's the mafia. And of course, when people say all the kind of usual guessing games, parlor games that are played, was it the mafia? Was it the Cuban exiles? Was it the Russians, the Cubans? Well, of course, the beauty of Mongoose was that it involved everyone. And so it's kind of missing the point, really. It involved CIA, it involved military intelligence, it involved, of course, the exiles, it involved mafiosi, it involved the Kennedys, of course, themselves. So, I think it's when you look at the kind of individuals we've identified, and we haven't actually mentioned Angleton. I think Angleton, as David suggested, with David Atley Phillips, when I started out writing my biography or my book on him, I was based on the Fonzie material, the Vesiana stories. Of course, as David said, some of that has now a lot of doubts being cast on it from John Newman and others about timelines and slippages and so on. But when I started my book, I was, entirely convinced that Phillips was involved in the assassination. But the more I delved into it, I mean, I would never go to the point where I'd say he wasn't. I think he remains, highly a figure of suspicion and a prime candidate. But it became very difficult compared to the likes of Harvey, I think Morales, to find a kind of smoking gun. I think for Morales and Harvey, and I think even Angleton, who was obviously more senior as the kind of counterintelligence, head of counterintelligence, I think there's a strong case to be made. I think with Phillips, as even those kind of people who proposed that Phillips was involved, I think it's very hard. I mean, even that, if you look at the things we know, that where there appears to be a huge amount of heat on Phillips, the meeting with Vesiana and Oswald, does that actually indicate that Phillips was directly involved in the assassination? No, it doesn't. It indicates that Phillips had some kind of operational relationship with Oswald. Now, some have made the argument that it's possible that people like Phillips could have run the operation in such a way that you piggyback the assassination onto other legitimate operations, and that would guarantee blackmail. And of course, when you look at the actual design of the plot, I think it's absolutely ingenious. And if you look at particularly, I think that the Rosetta Stone of the case, which is Oswald down in Mexico City, and that emerges very quickly in the aftermath of the assassination in the conversations between Hoover and Johnson, it becomes the number one reason that basically Hoover and Johnson decide that they need to start a cover-up, essentially, is that Oswald's down in Mexico City consorting supposedly consorting with the Russians and with the Cubans. And of course, this becomes, that's not really happening, is it? That's not actually, I think, the way that one would then, from everything we know after the case, it's likely that Oswald was being manipulated by people domestically. And I think, there's a strong case to be made that he was somehow being moved around by people like David Atley Phillips for the purposes of really psyops, for trying to discredit the kind of pro-Castro groups that Oswald was going around, setting up and so on. So, but I think when you look at that design of having Oswald in Mexico City, of then this quickly emerging, and suddenly, there's a very important kind of testimony that comes from a CIA official who was there in on the day of the assassination, and he says, when Oswald's name came on the radio, it was kind of, the effect was electric. He was known to them, and so of course the agency as an organization, as an institution, was not directly involved as an organization in the assassination, but there were obviously key people, probably, quite likely, as David said, people like Alan Dulles, people like Richard Helms, in the very much insulated arm of the agency, the covert operations arm, who were involved. But the institution as a whole is suddenly reacting to this kind of world historical event, the assassination, and they're going, "Oh my God, we have an operational relationship with this guy who's now the alleged assassin," and that very quickly leads to a huge, suppression and destruction and distortion of evidence, and a huge cover up. So I think that design in itself is absolutely ingenious, and that's what I think Angleton's he was actually talking to Cy Hirsch, and that's what he, I interviewed Cy Hirsch a few years ago, and that's what he alludes to, is he says to Cy Hirsch, the CIA is a mansion of many rooms. I'm not privy to who kind of bumped off Jag. And Hirsch kind of said, well, to someone else, not to myself, he felt that Angleton was basically trying to kind of throw him off the scent, really. And Angleton, I think what's very incriminating about Angleton is that there is a repeated pattern throughout the aftermath of this, which continues for years and years, throughout the 60s and 70s, where he does this. He's caught, of course, breaking into Mary Pinchot Meyer's house after the assassination. He threatens Win Scott, the CIA station chief in Mexico City, when Scott divulges information to, I think, a colleague in British intelligence, and Angleton phones him up and says, don't ever talk about this kind of stuff. Although Scott had, I think Scott had very, very little involvement, but it became clear to Win Scott that he'd been kept out of the loop, and that's why, when we talk about someone, well, I'll come back to that. But yeah, he also did it later when one of the Warren Commission lawyers in the 70s began to question the official version. Angleton phoned him up and threatened him. And Angleton wasn't someone to be taken lightly. He ran his own goons. He was a very menacing character. And you actually look at a lot of, I haven't perhaps delved as deep into Angleton as I would like, but you look at, his interviews with journalists, etc. I mean, some of the stuff he was coming out with, he was very close to Harvey. Of course, Harvey and Angleton were very good friends. But some of the stuff that Angleton would say about the church committee and about the hearings that were going on, he considered that stuff to be the kind of very definition of I think Harvey described it as kind of Cromwellian treason. I mean,
well, it's much like J. Edgar Hoover and the Warren Commission. He considered himself an adversary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Angleton was the liaison, wasn't he, to the Warren Commission? Him and Rocker, his deputy. And I think if you look at Angleton, that pattern of behavior with Angleton, where when Win Scott dies, Angleton's literally there. This is in Mexico. Angleton's there the next day, and he's persuading, strong-arming his widow, who's in the midst of obviously grieving. I mean, Win Scott's died quite suddenly. He's had a kind of a rather strange accident, I think, where he's fallen off the ladder in the garden, and before you know it, he's taken ill and dies. And Angleton Angleton's there, and he gets hold of, because Scott was kind of something of an autodidact. He had this kind of filing system. He'd taken files that he shouldn't have done, and he had a huge amount of information on Oswald, of course, from his Mexico City operation days. And Angleton manages to get all of that sealed and transported to Washington, and it's, I think, never seen again. When Angleton dies, they can't get into his kind of safes in the CIA HQ. They have to get these kind of safe crackers. They open those safes, they crack them open. There's some really disturbing material in there. I think there's autopsy photos. There's a whole bunch of stuff on Oswald. There's autopsy photos of Robert Kennedy, apparently. You listen to kind of Angleton railing about things like the Church Committee, and he describes them as almost like communists. He is so kind of such, as David says, such kind of extremist, kind of radical firebrands, some of these people, that they saw, they saw the Kennedys as, they saw that their kind of moves towards rapprochement with the Soviets, with, exploring a dual track approach with the Cubans. They saw that as kind of treasonous. That's what this clique of kind of diehards, that's how they perceived it. These people are angry. You've got Carl Jenkins, he's still alive. You've got Grayston Lynch writing his kind of his autobiography and his account of the Bay of Pigs 40 years later. And these people are still, when they talk about the Kennedys, Carl Jenkins interviewed by Jefferson Morley recently, I think last year, they're still angry about the Bay of Pigs. They're still, these people decades on are livid about it. And sorry, I've just been sabotaged myself here by a covert operation. So my little ones decided to pop up.
I'll ask you one final point here, but how much of the reliance of opening up documentation, or at least getting down to more of a definitive, because I don't think we'll ever have a definitive account of a number of people that were involved, that were either part of the CIA or however. So I'll put Mayhew on that list. And obviously there's a little bit of weird connection with Howard Hughes there, the billionaire playboy. But I would ask you guys, when it comes to documentation, who's more in line to get down to the bottom of it? Would that be individuals or commissions that have done more work to expose certain covert operations, or does that on the reliance of individual researchers who obviously have got a trace of something and end up prying in deeper connections and interviewing other individuals? Because obviously people want an answer. It's been 60 something years. A lot of the Assassination Records Review Board members have some different opinions on the CIA, whether they were given the full story or not. And I've spoken to them individually to be able to understand that. But there's a lot of stuff that obviously wasn't written down, but it seems like researchers have been pulling more of a lot of weight, which leads to their own speculation in certain areas, which at this point, it's not going to happen. You're not going to have a definitive document to tell you this person ended up doing this or doing that. We have it on some things, but not everything.
Well, let's deal with that. As far as, I think the obvious answer is independent researchers have probably gotten a lot farther with this because of will, determination, desire to get to the truth. Now, I mean, from a standpoint of quote unquote government investigations, I think what they have provided is, a certain limited amount of information that we can try to glean something from. There are still several thousand documents that have not been released, that despite the Assassination Review Board's mandate that they should have been, other than blocking by the President of the United States. I think Biden decided we're going to wash our hands of it, after a series of releases and then, more criticism because why haven't you released the rest of it? What does that mean? So there's still some documents that might be very sensitive to the CIA. Would they be documents that said, hey, CIA did it, here's the ones that did it? Probably not. But I think what the remaining documents that are out there that we haven't seen yet, what they would tell us, and we mentioned limited hangout, I think with those documents, if not already, we would have a complete history of the fact that the CIA was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, at least that. Now, will they say, because the CIA's position has always been, no, we had no involvement with Oswald. That's a lie. I mean, they obviously had their hands all over Oswald. Now, what does that mean? I think that for the rest of us is a level of speculation, a level of effort to try to get to the bottom and who benefited the most, who controlled the scene in Dallas, I think is very important. Some of the most virulent Kennedy haters with enormous power were right down there in Dallas. The Sweet 8F group, those people that a good place to start. Who controlled the Texas School Book Depository where the Patsy was placed? And the answer is D.H. Byrd. Who was Byrd connected to? Just about everybody, man. I mean, Byrd was connected to some of the most powerful people in Texas. He was connected to LeMay. He was connected, some of these biggest Kennedy haters and people. He was friends with Otto Skorzeny, who was the center of the CIA's attempts to get Nazis out of World War II. There's just a whole lot of things there that you can look, but that's what we're left to do, is to look. I don't think you're going to have a government agency reveal to us all that we need to know about what happened in Dallas. I think we need to get to those greater truths in our mind with what we had. There was no legitimate investigation that carries enough weight to give us that truth. So here we are. We have a kind of a gap. Hopefully, historically, at least, we can come to some historical conclusions if that there's enough weight there to suggest that the idea that Oswald acted alone was and still is ludicrous. Now let's at least come to some ideas about the truth about what happened in Dallas, that there were others involved, and try to figure out who those people are. I went a long way, but it's going to be up to people like us. If you expect the United States government to come out and tell us the whole truth and nothing but the truth about what happened in Dallas, you're going to be waiting a long time. Okay? That would be my answer.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's positives and negatives. I think that where we are today, I guess we are a hell of a lot further down the track than anyone could have possibly anticipated. I don't think when these kind of people, I think Alan Dulles would be spinning in his grave now if he if he knew how much had been exposed about their operations. So I think the information, the material, the data that's been revealed as a result of the 70s investigations is a treasure trove. It's been incredibly important to democracy and to the rule of law, for us to understand as a society what these kind of secret arms of government are up to. And of course, these entities, and in the words of the likes of Harvey and Angleton, I mean, Angleton said that it was impossible to expect an intelligence agency to comply with all the kind of the directions and policies of the government. So, I mean, these were people who strongly believed in secrecy, and of course, a degree of secrecy is required to run, these kind of things. But they basically had, until the limited oversight that was later implemented, they had kind of unlimited, unchecked power, and they carried out things that were monstrous, essentially, for not just the kind of democratic health of the United States, but for tens of regimes across the world. But I think one of the most interesting things is that Alan Dulles, during the kind of executive sessions of the Warren Commission, he says something about how we shouldn't worry too much about the impact of this report. He basically says, don't believe people in this country read. A few journalists, he says, they'll just flick through it. There'll only be a kind of couple of professors who'll read it kind of from beginning to end. And I think, although Dulles was actually a very shrewd operator, a very obviously powerful man who, along with his brother, of course, John Foster Dulles, wielded a huge amount of power and influence, and with his Georgetown kind of address book was connected to just about everyone in the American power structure in Wall Street and in terms of military industrialists and so on. But I think Dulles actually miscalculated there, and I think that's understandable that you would make that error in 1963 when nothing was known. When we didn't know, when it was a completely different world, and none of the stuff that in only a matter of a few years would come out had been revealed. And I think actually the knock-on effect of the David is obviously teaching about the political assassinations of the 1960s, those assassinations that followed of Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, of others, Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the stuff that got exposed, of course, during those 70s investigations with the assassination plots, with media kind of manipulation, with all kinds of things. Moving into the 21st century with everything that's been happening, of course, in the last 20 years in the war on terror and so forth, I think you can draw a line from Dallas 1963 in terms of that narrative up to the present day, in terms of how there has been a huge collapse in public faith in government and institutions. And when we talk about kind of fake news, when the very interesting thing about Trump, whatever one may think of him, is that he's somehow the things he talks about in terms of fake news and post-truth and all of that is somehow a kind of postmodern manifestation of all of this stuff, that you had these very powerful government agencies carrying out with carte blanche these kind of seismic events, what Peter Dale Scott describes as deep events of geopolitical significance that remain buried in secrecy. You had all of that going on, and we still to this day we're talking about how we don't know exactly what happened in Dallas. It's astonishing, a democratically elected president of the United States who was popular, who was youthful, who was dynamic, who represented a real kind of hope and optimism, was just gunned down in broad daylight on a routine visit. And to this day, we don't really know what happened. We have a pretty, good educated stab at it today, and lots of thousands of others do, and millions of people still care. Every time there's a story about the Kennedys or about the assassination, it garners column inches, it garners broadcast coverage. So, people deep down know that these things matter, and that you cannot just execute. Well, you can obviously, but that you cannot execute popular, charismatic leaders who represent change and hope and optimism without there being kind of consequences. And I think actually, even for the kind of the power elite, as C. Wright Mills used to call them, I think that the consequences of that culture of secrecy that has reverberated over the past few decades is actually likely to backfire. And I think it's very dangerous, potentially. So I think this, and we've seen hints at this perhaps in the last few years, we need a kind of catharsis. We need some kind of process, by which we begin to understand what happened during these kind of deep events. But yeah, I'll probably leave it there, I think.
Gentlemen, I appreciate the time you gave me to do my show today and be able to talk about this. I'm going to make sure I link all your links in the description for people to be able to click on. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next.